are pleased, we're pleased to welcome Mr. Sandew Hira, whose pen name is Du Baborum. He's a director of the Institute for Scientific Research in The Hague. IISR is an institute for research into decolonizing the mind. IISR publishes a book series titled Decolonizing the Mind with Amrit Publishers. Stephen Small and Arzu Morali are co-editors of the series, and Mr. Hira is secretary of the Decolonial International Network Foundation. He studied economics at the Erasmus University Rotterdam in Holland and has written 16 books on different topics, among them colonial history. His forthcoming book is titled Decolonizing the Mind, A Guide to Decolonial Theory and Practice, published by Amrit Publishers. Mr. Hira, you're welcome and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for inviting me, and congratulations with the book, the new book. I'm looking forward to reading it and learn more about your work. Let me start with sharing my screen, and I go through the issues that I will deal with. First of all, it's important to see the chapter, what we are talking today about epistemology, in the context of what I try to do in the book, which is to develop a coherent, comprehensive, and integral theoretical framework for decolonial theory. And the reason I've been working for it for 12 years now, and felt the need to go beyond what very much now is in decolonial theory about epistemology, social theory. But if it needs to be comprehensive, and I'm looking at liberalism, Marxism as the two main comprehensive, coherent, and integral theoretical frameworks which the West has produced. Outside the West, you have other ones like the Islamic theory of how to look at the world from an Islamic perspective. It is comprehensive because it produces concepts of how to look at the most important dimensions of society. A worldview, how do you view world history? How do you view economics, the economic foundation of a society, the political structure, social relations, including relations with nature, and how do you see culture, knowledge production, and so on. And so if you have a comprehensive framework, it should cover all these aspects. It should be coherent because these concepts, which are in the different sectors, couldn't contradict each other. They should be supporting each other. They should be consistent and logical. And it's integral because it has a basis. In liberalism, it is individual freedom. In Marxism, class struggle. I chose mental slavery and decolonizing the mind as a foundation for decolonial theory. You know, people can have other foundations, obviously, and develop it in another way. So that's so the epistemology is embedded in this framework. Then the other aspect which is important is how I look at knowledge production from a GTM perspective, decolonial perspective, and I see three elements. One is a critique of Eurocentrism. If we argue that there's something wrong with Eurocentric knowledge production, then we cannot abstain from criticizing what is wrong and why is this wrong. And then when you do the critique, you need to have an alternative. So if you think that is wrong, what is then the alternative knowledge? And then when you have the alternative knowledge, what does it mean for practical policies of government, social movements? So these three elements are very important in developing this comprehensive, coherent, and integral theoretical framework. What I do in the book is I present this concept of the theoretical framework in the introduction. Then I go into the background of the decolonial movement and theory, because it's something of the last 30 years. And I try to think about what is it that made this decolonial movement rise in the past decades. Then I discuss liberalism and Marxism as two Eurocentric philosophies of liberation as they conceptualize this. I go to the concept of mental slavery, what it means, what it is. I discuss the mechanisms of colonizations of the mind. And then in chapter 5, which I'll do today, I go through epistemology. From epistemology, I develop this theory of racism in three historical periods and also three types linked to the authority of knowledge: theological racism, biological racism, and cultural racism. And then I go into the different fields: world history, economic theory, social theory, cultural theory, political theory, link it to the concept of civilization, and contrasting the colonial world civilization with a new world civilization, and where we are now in this particular period of world history. And I deal with mathematics and the natural sciences in a separate chapter. Now, going into epistemology, there's immediately the difference between Western philosophy, Western theories of epistemology, theories of knowledge, and that is that they don't acknowledge that there's also mental slavery. They don't acknowledge that there is manipulation of the mind and that there are lies produced. So there's only a theory of knowledge, not a theory of lies. And what I argue with DTM, that DTM has a theory of knowledge and lies. To understand how the theory of knowledge has developed within the West, it's important to understand that it has developed in opposition to Christian theology. Science had to struggle from all the limitations that Christian theology had imposed on knowledge production. And to understand the nature and the prevalence and how we needed society, I give this example of James Ussher, Archbishop, who developed a calculation, a scientific calculation on when God had created the earth. And he did it, by going through the genealogy of all the figures in the Bible. In the Bible, people could become 100 years old, 1,000, even 900 years old. And then he came up with Sunday, October the 23rd, 4004 BCE at 6 p.m. that God had created the world. Now, this was accepted at that time as valid knowledge. But when in the West, particularly in the 17th centuries, Western scientists developed knowledge, they had to battle and struggle against Christian theology. And there is where eventually in the West, knowledge was separated from ethics, which was part of religion. Other civilizations as well, and it didn't have this conflict. Now, to understand how knowledge was separated from ethics, or ethics was separated from knowledge, we have to study the history of Western philosophy. And my take on the study of the history of Western philosophy is that the separation of ethics from knowledge, so was that knowledge was about what is true or false, and ethics was about what is right or wrong. And it was done in 5 steps. One is to argue that knowledge is derived from experience, not from religious texts, Locke, later Hume. The second was to argue that you don't need only experience and observations, but you need reasoning, you need analysis, which is kind of contributions. And then the third step is that theoretical knowledge should predict outcome, Hegel, later Popper. And so you have this idea that knowledge is derived from observation and reasoning. And then Comte goes a step further and says that human knowledge develops in different steps, and the highest steps is positivism, where knowledge is truly separated from theology. And then he introduced this concept of different stages of knowledge of human intellect, and then taking the final stage where the application of positivism, observation and reasoning, is applied to the natural and the social world. So there's no right and wrong in mathematics or astronomy, and so there's no right and wrong in social sciences. Obviously, there could be subjective things, but Weber, and if you look at the sociologists of those times, basically argues you could put out of you could put the subjectivity out by putting a structure of data collection and interpretation, which at the end is objective. Now, then comes what I propose and what I argue at DTM epistemology, knowledge production that's based on concept. Knowledge, central to knowledge is concept. Concept is an idea that describes and explains certain aspects of social and cultural, social and natural world. And then I go through 5 aspects: terminology, a linguistic expression of a concept; observation, which is a collection of facts; analysis, which is explaining the facts, why are things as they are; and then the theory is not always there, but how are the different concepts relate to a bigger, wider view of the natural and social world; and then ethics, which is out of the Eurocentric knowledge production, but is part of the DTM knowledge production. So the difference between DTM and Eurocentric epistemology comes down to the distinguish between knowledge and that effect and acknowledgement that there are lies, then the use of the same kind of research methods for knowledge in the human societies and the study of the natural world, often ending in the use of mathematics extensively in social sciences, and the use of the two-value logic. I'll come later on to logic. Then I go to who is producing knowledge. You know, obviously we have the academics in academia, and in the Western society, these are the gods of the world, replacing the priest of Christian theology. And then the professors tell you by research what you should think about how to interpret the world. But decolonial knowledge is also produced in academia, and obviously you are the examples of it. Then there are decolonial academics outside academia. Not everybody works in the academia after they have studied, and they produce books, and so and many others are also examples of it. And then there are concepts that has been produced by artists, activists, spiritual leaders, and they come up with concepts that we use in the production of knowledge. So I use my friend Stephen Small from University of California, Berkeley, used to say when we are discussing European slavery and people say, oh, we might not know what the truth is. And then he always says, we might not know what the truth is, but we certainly know what lies is. And it's different than what in Eurocentric philosophy is seen the opposite of truth, which is error, you know. And the way lies are produced is by manipulating these 5 elements of the concept. Then the other big difference is between DTM epistemology and Eurocentric epistemology is that Eurocentric epistemology is based on observation and reasoning, and other sources of knowledge are excluded because of weaknesses they have. And I argue these weaknesses are also in the Eurocentric epistemology and observation and reasoning. Obviously, observation and reasoning is still important, but there are other innate knowledge, common sense, social interactions, creativity, and imagination and cosmology. And to explore how these sources of knowledge, how these sources produce knowledge and what the validity of it is one of the challenges of the future. Then I go into logic. I discuss Aristotelian formal logic, which is very often used, two-value logic, something is true or false, and put that against logic. I go into the Jaina logic of Indian Jain philosophy, which has 7 values of logics. And I also mentioned Hegel's dialectics, which is also a logic of change, and where Hegel and especially Engels later developed it systematically. Now, how is natural sciences and social sciences related? So in DTM, this is a major difference, because I argue that the study of natural phenomena and social phenomena, the difference is that human study human is different than human studying nature. And the question of object and subject of study is important, because there is where the manipulation of knowledge is prevalent. And obviously, even in the study of nature, there are ethics involved in how you study nature and how you do it and how you deal with ecology. I put one thing which I found very interesting from my dear friend Raju, C.K. Raju, mathematician in New Delhi, India. And he put me on the track of decolonizing mathematics. I've very long had a big interest in mathematics. To see that mathematics could be decolonized was for me interesting, because it came out of the critique of the the methodology of research in natural and social sciences. So in decolonizing mathematics, I distinguish obviously the historiography of mathematics, which is a smaller thing in my view. Then the critique of the foundation of mathematics, Euromathematics, I'll come to that later. A critique of the use of mathematics, how mathematics is used to create lies. The concept of reverse engineering in mathematics. How did the Egyptians build a pyramid without having access to Eurocentric formal mathematics? How did they do all these calculations? And how did other civilizations do that? It's interesting, and obviously, how is mathematics being taught here, and how could that change? And in terms of the foundations, the critique of the foundations of mathematics, I go into the critique of the concept of axioms, where now mathematics is based on, while other non-Western mathematics was based on empirical proof. And once you detach that, and I give the example of the Ramanujan series, you get crazy results in Eurocentric mathematics, where the Ramanujan series, for example, which is 1 + 2 + 3 until infinity, the end result of it is a negative number, basically saying that if I give you $1, $2, $3, you end up in debt. That is the logical calculations of that comes out of Euro mathematics, which wouldn't be able where in let's say Indian mathematics, which is based on empirical truth. Now, this is more or less the central issues I deal with in epistemology, and I suggest let's go to the discussions, because I presume most of you might have read the chapter, and I'm very much interested in the discussion about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hira. Connie, over to you. Let's start the discussion.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for this discussion. I have a couple of issues that I would like to help you. I want you to help me understand. What does a decolonial theory of lies consists of. Right. I can understand a decolonial theory of knowledge and all that, but I lost you a bit when you were now talking about so I then began to ask myself, if you were going to colonize theories of lies, what exactly do you do?
Okay. Right. You do 5 things. I introduced the notion of conceptual thinking. Thinking with the notion of concepts that consists of these 5 elements. One is, first you look just simply at how people name something. For example, I give the example of Columbus, you know, and the way the story of Columbus is articulated is as a voyage of discovery.
Yes.
Not as a crime against humanity, which is a different way of attaching a linguistic expression to a series of events. So what we see all the time when we look at how concepts are articulated in linguistics, and you are an expert of that, so I could learn more from you on it than you from me. So I'm also very interested in how linguistics creates lies. So let's take, I have a book on, I have a chapter on feminism, and I use the work of Oyorinka, who is also here, and where she explains that the term for gender is not there in Nigeria, and so you could use terminology to create lies by using terms which are not an expression of what really happened, but interpreted in such a way, like the whole story of discovery, you know, and then on that foundation, you build, you limit the observation of facts. You know, let me tell you two interesting facts about the voyage of Columbus. First was that the character of Columbus was presented as this innovative, you know, person seeking a new route to India, and that's why he called the indigenous people Indians. If he was looking for a route to China today, they would be named Chinese. So what basically happened there is that the story of the greed of Columbus is part of this. In the book, I tell the story of how, you know, one of the sailors discovered first land and shouted land, and then you know, he was to get 10,000 golden coins, and he didn't get it. And you leave that story out. You leave the second story out of the kidnapping of the Tainos who were brought eventually to Spain. So the observation of facts and leaving out the genocidal things is the second way to manipulate and create lies. That's how you create lies. You limit the observation to things that fits in your story. And then the third is you create the storyline. You create a storyline where these facts and the terminology are put in such a sequence and such a framework that you accept that it was a journey of a scientific journey, you know, of discovery rather than a crime against humanity. And then if you put that specific sequence of events into a larger theoretical framework of the rise of modernity, then that is how the theory of modernity is basically the creation of a modernized world is different than the theory of the creation of a barbaric world civilization. It's a different way, and that's how you produce lies. The concept of modernity is a lie, because what has been happening is barbarism, which was there for many thousands of years already. It wasn't modern. And then by leaving out ethics from knowledge, you discuss only true or false or not right and wrong. But right and wrong is part of knowledge production. So with these 5 elements, you could create lies. And that's why I come to the fact that if we have decolonial epistemology, it should engage in critique. It couldn't just proclaim, look, this is decolonial epistemology. You should criticize how lies are being produced. And that is basically what I do in the rest of the book. And what is economic theory? How is the lie created of Adam Smith and of invisible hand of the market? And how is the lie created of parliamentary democracy as an axiom, as something you don't need to prove whether parliamentary democracy is the best system. You just proclaim it and accept it. And that goes to feminism, gender theory, and it goes to all the other concepts of patriarchy, for example, as a universal concept. So basically what I try to do is to use the methodology of how concepts are created as a way to show how lies are created. And the thing is, it's uncomfortable because in the academia, when you talk about lies, you talk about integrity of people, you see? But you assume that people are honest, and with good heart. And the thing is that, I criticize whether that's the case or not.
So are you saying this then, that Eurocentric scholarship to some extent consists of creative? That the argument?
Yes.
That's the argument you're making. Okay. So if that is the argument you are making about lies, then the next question is, what are the theories that you think will help us understand how centricism disseminates these lies?
Okay.
Because if we're going to counter these lies, we need to understand functionally how these lies are disseminated.
Okay. So let me share my screen. I think that would be the best, and then I'll show you chapter 4, which and all the techniques. I discussed, I think, almost 40 techniques.
Oh, okay.
How this is being done.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you an example, just to give an idea of what kind of research we need to do in the future.
Yes.
Let me see here. Okay. You see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, let me see. I'm here. Okay. Take, for example, divide and rule as a mechanism,
Mm-hmm.
right? And Ngugi's book is an interesting book on decolonizing the mind, where he gives examples of how when students were forced, not to talk their primary language, how other students were used in identifying those who fell out of line and then were punished. So you could take those case studies, you could take how hypocrisy and double standard is used, how the organization of amnesia is organized, forgetting facts. You talk about the Holocaust, but you don't talk about all the crimes that colonialism has created in 500 years of history. How intimidation is used to silence voices of critique. How the idea is produced of a struggle between good and evil in politics, how demonization is used. So I gave, I think, more than 40 or 30 examples of these mechanisms which are used to promote and create and disseminate lies.
You can ask another question to help me understand what your project is all about. I like the idea that in your chapters that talk about decolonizing mathematics, sciences, world history, economic theory, political theory, and then you conclude with world civilization. Let me explain why I liked to find a book in which all those approaches are in a single book. Because there are a lot of different books that are looking, let's say, at decolonizing mathematics, decolonizing political theory, but so the information is scattered everywhere. So it takes a bit of time to be able to synthesize all that information to see how does decolonization play itself out in all these areas. But you are in a unique position because you have written about decolonizing mathematics, world history, economic theory, etc. So my question to you is this, which I think I should know, but I don't know at the moment. Are there any common features across all these different subject areas that you were able to find which recur when you are talking about decolonization of the discipline? So is there something similar in decolonizing mathematics, which is found also in decolonizing history, which is found also in decolonizing economic theory, which is found also in decolonizing political theory? In other words, are there certain features that you find across different disciplines once you start adopting a decolonial theory of the...
Yes, definitely. So what, in the 12 years that I've been intensively looking at this,
Yes.
First of all, I came to see how little I know.
Yeah.
Even now, even now. So I caution that, the pretension that this is a kind of things and that's it. Because I've seen so much, I know how this first cannot be an individual effort.
Yes, yes. Okay. Yeah.
It must be a collective effort. That is first of all. Second, there has been produced so much knowledge outside of the West that when we study a discipline, we should always look at how civilizations outside of the West have thought about these questions. Take economic theory, right? Take mathematics, take social theory. In all these things, I first isolate basic concepts. What are basic concepts? Because the disciplines are very wide, and when it specializes, you have a huge amount of literature. But you first, in all the disciplines, you see what is the central or the one or two central concepts on which a lot of things are built. For example, in world history, is a concept of a linear development of history. I argue that there is a spiderweb development of history, where civilization develop in different directions rather than the idea that civilizations develop from simple to complex, from barbarism to modernity, from hunting to socialism. This linear concept is in world history a central concept. In economics, in liberal theory, it's the concept of the market and the private ownership of means of production, liberalism. In Marxism, it is the labor theory of value is the central concept, and out of that come class struggle and all these other things. So in mathematics, for example, is the axiomatic approach versus the empirical approach. So the axiomatic approach is a central concept. So in all the disciplines, I look what are central concepts. Then I criticize the central concept, and then I look to, but people have been thinking outside the West for thousands of years. They have produced ideas. What are the ideas that they have produced that can still be valid? And if it comes to, let's say, philosophy, epistemology, logic, I give the example of the giant logic. And also, the approach is to look at the different civilizations and then discuss also what is the practical implication of all this. What does it mean? Because there's also a tendency in Western scientific where you develop theory that has nothing to do with practice and are still produced as great theory, obviously in mathematics, but also you would have, for example, take social theory. You could see the development in the United States of Talcott Parson and sociology in United States in a period where there was apartheid in the United States. And then the sociologists developed theories, functional, without looking, but what society are you living in? How does that theory explain the society and try to understand society? So what is common, I look at basic concept, I criticize the basic concept, I look at alternative concept, and I look at the practical implications.
Let me hand over to Magda. I can always come back depending on how the conversation goes. Magda.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Makoni, and thank you, Mr. Hira. So we have a question from Mohammed. So first, thank you for your thoughtful, thought-provoking presentation and the chapter that you shared with us. So Mohammed says, it is often said that an Archimedean objective perspective in producing human knowledge. Aren't we stuck with a history of knowledge that is a history of lies and counter-lies ad infinitum?
Sorry, the Archimedean objective is impossible. Sorry, I missed that.
Okay.
Did you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying, Mohammed.
Okay. Now, my argument is that one source of knowledge is social interaction, right? So you get that knowledge through the aspect of social interaction. I give the example of Descartes, and I always recommend to go to the primary sources. Whenever we talk about philosophy, if we talk about Descartes, read Descartes, not read about Descartes, right? And Descartes had this interesting thing when he developed the theory of, I think therefore I am, he used the thing of dream, a dream, that you dream. And that's an interesting thing. How do you know if you are dreaming? If you are the only person on earth, there's no way you can ascertain, oh, this is a dream or not, because it's all in your head. Only if you have social interaction with others, you can know whether you're awake or not. So if we are to decide what is true or lies, within the Western epistemology, you have the method of observation and reasoning. Observation is done in such and such a way, and reasoning done in inductive or deductive methodology. So, but if you accept that social knowledge is also a source of knowledge, then whether something is objective or subjective and whether it's problematic or not is part of the discussion of social interaction. It's not determined by a rule, it's determined in the social interaction about what particular things are we talking about. Is it true that in order to build a bridge, you need 10 tons of concrete? Well, whether it's true or not, or objective or subjective, is what kind of bridge and what do you want, and all these things determine it if you take empirical knowledge as a basis. You see? But if you say, for example, which Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead did, they wrote a book to prove that 1 and 1 is 2, 360 pages, not based on empirical things. And then you could end up in nonsense. because I discussed that in the book on mathematics, why those kinds of exercises are futile, and basically, if you discuss it, it's counterproductive. So is the objective or is the subjective can be something that is not defined before hand, you see? It's defined in the discussion of it. And that is also the question of maybe what Magda said about post-truth. Maybe you should develop that, Magda, what you mean by post-truth. You mean postmodernism, where, or do you mean something else?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to expand. I just put it as a placeholder. So I used to teach a course in which I've been using a book by Catherine Sorrells. She's a communicator, and I've noticed that many journalists, they are talking about the post-truth in the manipulation of the facts, of the information that is shared with people. So there's this common statement: we all have our truths, which Catherine Sorrells she critiques, saying that we have all our opinions, not our truths. And she used an example, the insurrection of January 6th, when certain statements by Mr. Trump were taken as the truth. So she called this era, right? And it's not her term that she uses, the post-truth, but I was just wondering how your thinking relates to this concept of post-truth that now people are starting to talk about post-truth. I'm a little bit concerned about it because I hope there is nothing post about the truth.
Yes, I think it's also in relation to the concept of fake news, in the sense that people, the interesting about the Trump developments in the US is that somebody can come up and say, look, whatever the facts are, this is what I think, and this is for me the facts. Now, I would argue, but there's nothing new for me. That's 500 years. It's not something of the last few years. I give you the example of Columbus, which is post-truth, if that is what you all call it, what we call a lie. So I would argue that in the kind of scientific environment that we create is not to find the rules that define what is truth or not, but to define the conversation which enables you. So in this case, I would say, well, I have a methodology. Somebody else could have another methodology. Obviously, the West have another methodology, which is induction, deduction, as a way to ascertain or to develop theories and truths. I come with conceptual thinking with the 5 elements of it. So it's then a question of assessing the validity in practical daily life of all these approaches, rather than defining, oh, this is the definition and this is criteria to determine what is truth or not truth. Because there are different criteria possible, and I would have rather the discussion about it than the proclamation, this one is valid and not. Let's see how it works. Okay, and then
thank you. Yeah, I see that you are reading the.
Yeah,
the
yeah. But
yes, so we have a question from Agogo. Yes, of course you can. Sometimes it's better to read it, but I will read for the rest of the participants. So Agogo, if you want, of course, Agogo, you can also make additional comments in person. So Agogo asks, how do you deal with the seeming linguistic / language trap of using the same problematic terminologies while trying to decolonize? An example would be the term alternative, which expresses imposed hierarchies and orthodoxies.
This problem I have come across during the past 12 years when I was studying other knowledge systems. So take, for example, the question of gender. And I think Oyoronko's here is a master in it and could express it better than I can do. But in her work, where she says the translation, of concept of mother and father from English to another language which doesn't have that concept is very problematic. So how do you translate a concept which is not mother and father in English? Is different, is not related to bodies, but other kind of social relation structures. And the English doesn't have terms for it. You see? So maybe we need to create new terms. At least we should show the imperfections of the English language in grasping concepts which are more elaborate than the terms in the English language could express. In many things, in terms of, for example, take let's say economic theory. What is an efficient distribution of resources? When is it efficient? It's efficient if you use the notion of greed, because behind the notion of greed lies this mechanism of price fluctuation, price and demands. You see, and maximum profit is which I call greed. Maximum profit is the mechanism for efficiency. But in other societies, that could be very inefficient, because maximum profit could lead to the fact that you produce milk that is not distributed because the price is not right and the milk is thrown away. It's very inefficient from a perspective of a society that looks for satisfying human need. But when you have efficiency as a concept in a society that takes greed as the basis for economic theory, what is efficiency? You see? So yes, how do we deal with it? Well, we face it. We talk about it. We, put it there, as Ayoka did with gender, or as Mohammed al-Sadr, Iraqi economist of the 1930s, did with Islamic economic theory. Discusses, criticize it, try to find new terms and new terms.
Thank you, and we have a comment from Ronke. Ronke, go ahead.
Happy New Month, everyone.
Same to you.
Hello, Sandew. Good
Hello,
to see you.
Good to hear from you. We met in Barcelona.
Was in Barcelona. Okay. Yes, very interesting. But unfortunately, I didn't have the chance to read the chapter. I didn't even know it was there. I mean, this is a busy time. So forgive me for that. I'm going to base my question on some of the comments you've been making and the presentation. I mean, one of the things that immediately struck me as you were going through this very comprehensive book that you have written, I'm looking forward to looking at it. One of the things that struck me is that I wondered what you did with the concept of the social construction of knowledge. And I say that because the whole idea of the social construction of knowledge is usually central to my pedagogy, in which we talk about the different perspectives from which people apprehend reality, number one. Then number two, I also wonder what you do with the whole question of power. How is the question of power central to how you articulate the whole issue of knowledge? Because when you talk about Eurocentrism, or whether you are talking about Max Weber or the other sociologists at Harvard and all that. I'm a sociologist, so I know what I call their foolishness. The issue is that they never acknowledged that the other people you are looking at were human in the first instance. So if they don't acknowledge that they are human, as W.E.B. Du Bois found, the sociologists were busy theorizing American society. Some of them were slaveholders and pretended that there are no Black people, there are no slaves. So at one level, I think fundamentally, we have to talk about power in order to even begin to look at any of these issues. And I see the impact of who has power, who doesn't. In your work, in my work, okay, I love my book, and so many people love it, about gender, coloniality of gender and all that. But the theories that are still being perpetuated, whether in the United States or in Nigeria or everywhere else, is still the Western theory. So how do you deal with the issue of power? Because ultimately, I think that that's what it's about. And then finally, let me end here. You talk about economic theory, this theory, and all those things. These are Western terminologies. We're still doing this work in a Western framework. And I think that is the crucial problem. And I don't know how you get through it in the comprehensive book you've written. Thank you.
Thank you, Rinka. Good to hear from you. Well, the question of power is central because I argue that we are in a colonial world civilization now, a civilization of 500 years. And the way this colonial world civilization has manipulated knowledge is through power. How knowledge is manipulated is not only in the mechanisms of knowledge productions, but also in how universities, for example, are organized. I'm outside the university, but I've dealt with the universities very extensively because I criticize in Holland, where I was involved in criticizing historians. And then you get the whole question of authority of knowledge production. Who decides what concepts, what literature, what is being taught, how it is being taught, how to prevent critique at authority of knowledge? That is social struggle. It's not an academic struggle only. It's not only how do you propose a critique of theories, it's also how do you address the institutions and the organizations of universities. How is it related to social movements who are the driving force of change in society? Change hardly comes from the university. Universities react on change of society and, translate it, and then there's a struggle within academia between colonial and decolonial academics. That is a power struggle, see? And I think that's why I argue that if you develop knowledge without critiquing Western knowledge, and critiquing natural Western knowledge is also critiquing the authority that produces knowledge, that pretend to be objective and have often also in position of powers in terms of resources, the use of resources, financial or other resources. And I think a combination of social movement and decolonial academics in academia to address these issues of decolonizing the university. And at the end of the day, it should be a pluriversity because the concept of university is a Eurocentric concept. There's one university, one truth, but there are different knowledge production systems which should engage with each other. That's why it should be a pluriversity. this is all the things that this puts on the agenda, you see, and power is definitely something on the agenda, because power uses knowledge to colonize the mind. So and the question of the social construct of knowledge, you know, I think if you construct a concept, you see, let's look how the concept is constructed. The concept of, I give the example of patriarchy in the book, where the concept is constructed based on European experience. It's not based on experience of other civilizations which had other constructs, other organization of social relations. So when we're looking at those who say knowledge is constructed, when you think that it's constructed at random, that's never the case. There's never a random construction of anything. If something is constructed, articulated, is based on what is perceived, what you want to be perceived, what is selected as observation, what kind of analytic tool you use. So it's not an abstract thing. And then we can discuss whether one construct is valid for people who work with it or not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ronke. I don't see any more comments in the chat. I don't know. Okay, Mohammed, you would like to make a question? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Magda. In the article, there is a statement that keeps repeating itself, and I have some problems with it. You say, and I quote you, this is section 5.5.3, scientific knowledge production took place in advanced civilizations in which belief systems like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, I'm adding myself the parentheses here, have flourished without conflict. Only in the West, a conflict arose between science and ethics, end of quote. So for me, you beautifully deconstruct Eurocentrism, and I think we should add to it Euro-American centrism. And I think I've enjoyed that deconstruction of the whole system. But you seem to be quite nice and kind towards home production, knowledge production. In the global South, we've had our genocides, we've had our wars, we've had our injustices, we've had our dictatorships.
Yeah.
Just look around at what's going on here now. The Islamic world in the Middle Ages was going through its own enlightenment period, if you want. But the faqih, the religious man, won over the philosopher and the scientist, and therefore we went back into our own dark ages. Thank you. So that's really my
Thank you very much.
my take.
I like the modification of Euro into Euro-US, because
Okay.
obviously now we live in a world where the US dominates, you know, and yeah, that's something we have to look at it, because that is the driving force is the US now, not even Euro in the whole manipulation of knowledge. Yes, I make this statement about it. First of all, in another chapter, I cite Ali Shariati, and he wrote a beautiful letter, you know, when he visited the pyramids in Egypt, and he was thinking about the Chinese world and the great things that ancient civilization have done, then he wrote a letter to the toilers, those people who have been killed while they worked and who have been treated as slaves, and how those civilizations were built on the backs of those. See, so I would caution against, when I talk about other civilization, as if it is good civilization versus bad civilization, because if you do that, then you lose sight of what the horrors have been that humanity have faced in other civilizations as well. So what I try to do is to understand the discussion between scientists and Christian theologists in the Western civilization. Galileo, Bruno, all these people, Copernicus, and then look at how Hindu civilization or Islamic civilization, of Chinese civilizations, where obviously there's a lot that have been written about how knowledge has been produced there. I gave some of the references of both in the natural sciences and the social sciences, and here's the limitation of my knowledge, is that I didn't see that kind of extensive discussion that the Christian theologists had with scientists in other things, and that is basically due to my limitation of knowledge. What I always are interested in see, when I was discussing, for example, mathematics with C.K. Raju, and he is very much into how mathematics in India was formed, but obviously mathematics was formed in Egypt, in China, in Latin Abiyala, Latin America, as it was called. Then basically he showed me how all these mathematical construct, how do you take the root of 2? How do you calculate the root of 2? Now, obviously, they have done it in India and use it in building, architecture, because it's a central concept, you see. But he gave me the example of an Indian astronomer who did the same what Copernicus did and lived for 100 years. Well, when Galileo and Bruno, I think Bruno was even killed, Galileo was sentenced to prison lifelong. And there was a debate waging in Christianity about how to deal with it. I didn't saw those kind of debate when I looked at other civilizations, you see. That doesn't mean that it wasn't there. I just didn't see the type of the debates where, and obviously somebody who's an expert might point that out to me, and I'm happy to learn about it.
Sorry, what I meant is that, like, even the Islamic tradition, we had the philosophers and scientists killed, burnt, crucified, etc.
Oh, wow.
So just like Bruno, just like Bruno and the others, yes.
Okay, that's something I would, if you could send me some references, and I would like to take
I'll
note
be happy
of
to
it,
do
and,
that. Yeah.
Okay, and
sure.
if you could, maybe Magda could send you my email or whatever, and then I would be happy, because that is something I need to correct that.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. Can I just, is there anybody who wants to jump in? I can jump in and ask 1 or 2 questions.
We have one more question from Desmond. So, and also Agogo raised his hand. I don't know, Agogo, if
okay,
you
that's fine. That's fine.
Your previous question, or you have a follow-up question.
Desmond.
Okay, so let's go to Desmond then.
Okay.
Desmond, maybe you would like to ask your question in person.
Okay, let me try to do that. I lost my voice recently, so if you can't hear me clearly, apologies. But thank you so much, Sandew, for this, for taking on this encyclopedic project. I think it's not often that we see people who attempt to sort of wrap Euro-American, to use Mohammed's preference, to wrap Euro-American intellectual accomplishments in one piece. So thank you for doing that. I think you might already have addressed the question I want to raise here, that when you talked about preferring a discussion, and this is the question about post-truth, people engaging in a discussion rather than positing axioms and so forth. But I really want to return to that question, because in many ways it sort of sits at the core of my effort to make sense of what next one can do here. That is, if you cannot respond to or challenge, lies, what you're calling lies in this context, with a statement of facts. That is, I think, to use the example of your discussion of Columbus, to say, hey, what we've learned about Columbus are lies. These are the facts about what happened. Because facts are always from a particular point of view. If you don't approach it from that perspective, certainly we would be re-echoing the epistemic assumption that there are some universal truths, whether those are based on empirical experience or on logic, which is, again, I think part of what you've already raised objections to. So if we cannot do that, we cannot respond to lies with the restatement of facts, are we then faced with just a negotiation of which sets of facts one chooses to privilege here? Is that the political conversation? And if that is the case, and in a world in which the material benefits of what we call modernity today is often credited, sometimes without clear justification, on Euro-American civilization, is this a lost cause for the political science? So if you're thinking about how does this affect people's lives, if we get rid of the possibility that there are universal truths, which I think is a dangerous idea, and I think it's part of the reasons Euro-American modernity has been very successful in getting into people's minds and controlling the ways that people think. And I think it should be challenged. But if you challenge that, then we also have lost the basis upon which to defend anything called facts, anything called truth. And if that is the case, I would just settle with, the kind of negotiation I think one can do with Mohammed's point here. That is to say, you can blame the West for all its violence. Your own civilizations have a lot to blame. I'm just choosing to follow the West. In spite of all its collateral damages, it has a lot of benefits that I'd like to encourage here. Is that what we're left with? Or are there other possibilities to engage in this conversation?
Okay. Now, one of the major questions which I deal with every day as the Secretary of the Decoloniality International Network Foundation is, what's next? The question of what are we fighting for? Where are we heading? What is the next step to be done? Now, in terms of one of the major challenges was this notion of a comprehensive, integral, and coherent framework. It's a notion which Ramon Grossvogel, who is one of the founders of the foundation and has done a lot of work on decoloniality, been discussing a long time. Why, if you look at practical politics, there are two of those frameworks that rule the world now: liberalism and Marxism. And they have their framework developed in 300 years' times, 200 years' times in Marxism, and liberalism 300 years' time. Decolonial theory is just, 30 years, 40 years. So we have a long way to go. But these are frameworks that at the end of the day tells society, politicians, media, whatever, what to think and what to do, what is valid knowledge and what is not valid knowledge. So, and that is then codified in textbooks and in the curriculums, etc. So my argument is that at the end of the day, whatever we do ends up in a new educational system, new textbooks, new curriculum, new ways, maybe even of pedagogy, etc. So then when we think of how to counter lies, it's not just with facts. Facts is one of the 5 elements of conceptual thinkings. It's also about terminology. It's also about the storyline, the framework, the analysis. It's also about the greater theory. It's also about how right or wrong is put into true or false. So these are the things we need to discuss. And basically what we try to do is to first step into the knowledge of experts which are all over the world and can contribute to developing this framework where liberalism and Marxism have taken 200 or 300 years to do. And we are just at the beginning. So how do we do that? I think the kind of sessions you are organizing here is important, you know, contribution to it, connecting scholars, and sooner or later developing new textbooks. I remember when I, you know, this whole study on, sorry, when I did the whole study on feminism and the critique of feminism, I was shocked to see how few people used Oyerinki's work in terms of, you know, when you see feminist work, you think that should be one of the major things because it challenges it. And so there are many other things where new knowledge is being produced already and needs to be presented in a coherent way in discussions with other academics and activists, and through the link of activism, social movements, and academia. So there's not a lost cause. There's a lot of things to gain in the coming decades.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And it's all tied up to the notion of this new world civilization, and the discussion of what is a civilization, what is the cultural basis of a civilization, how does this new civilization, which is in the making now, a new economic order, a new political order, but also new knowledge system, how to decolonize the university, how to build a new pluriversity. All these things are practical questions, and see how we can, you know, get people making contributions to it.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. So there's one more question from Teboho, and then Makoni, we can wrap up. So Teboho asks, did Eurocentric theorists connive or each produce their part in their discipline, and most distortions of reality and truth just come together? Was there a common interest? If there was, is that not continuing to motivate them to distort knowledge today?
Well, there is a common interest in the power structures that control the world now, economically, politically, culturally, in knowledge production, socially, and that is to maintain the current colonial world civilization. Its political order, its colonial, its economic order, its cultural order. So I think that the distortion of knowledge we see every day at the 8 o'clock news, every second at whatever you read in the newspaper. See, so building this counter knowledge, a lot of people are contributed to it. Take the war in Ukraine, for example. Now, you know, there is a major narrative out there of the unprovoked Russian aggression, but there's also a narrative there, which is not in the major news networks, of a long history that led to this war, and how that could have been avoided if there were other takes on a new military security system in Europe. You see, so this is on a daily basis, and as we see that this alternative world is being developed with BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other things that are coming. I think we are at a crossroad where a new world civilization is being developed, like it or not. And the old one is dying, like it or not. But before it dies, we hope that it doesn't end in a nuclear war, that we're still alive to be able to build this new world civilization. But the concept of a new world civilization is at the heart of the discussion now. What does it mean? How does it look like? Internationally, locally, how does a society in US and Europe deals with the fact that there are legacies of that civilization within that world, the rise of Islam and other, So I think, yes, there's a big struggle ahead, and every one of us have a contribution in it.
Thank you. With that, let's wrap up, Makoni, and then if there are still some questions, we can stay for the after party. So Makoni, over to you to close.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I think this was interesting from a number of perspectives. One perspective is that we rarely have opportunities to have discussions with academics who are interested in working outside the universities, who are activists like you. So that is really quite an interesting conversation that cuts across universities and activism and people who are activists. We are at the moment negotiating with two activists who may come in sometime next year. One is one of the most powerful South African female political leaders. We're trying to negotiate and find a time when she can come and talk to us. A guy who was signed to Robben Island, but then left Robben Island and came and created a career at Wall Street and then went back to South Africa and rose through the banking industry. So because what we are trying to do is to expand the range of people that we have that we have conversations with, to include not only activists, but people of social movements, like our colleague today. Then the other thing that was quite interesting to me was how that today was able to gather a number of different ideas, which at times to me were in conflict. I liked the idea that knowledge is generated through social interaction. But then I wasn't saying, if that argument is valid, then why then did you have the title of your book called Decolonizing the Mind? Because it then separates the mind from social interaction. So I was trying to work out in my mind how you are able to hold conflicting ideas all at the same time. But I really liked the work that you are doing, and I think we will all look reading your book when it comes out in January. Now we are going to shift to what is called the after party, which is not moderated, and we just have conversations amongst ourselves. Yeah, thanks, Magda.